The silence in the interrogation room of the 2nd Northern Camp was not an absence of sound, but a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. It was January of 1938, a year when the wind itself seemed to whisper accusations. Alexei sat on a wooden stool bolted to the floor, his fingers numb, his ribs aching from the previous day's encounter with a rifle butt. Across from him sat Major Sokolov, a man whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about in the barracks with the same reverence one might give to a plague. Sokolov did not speak for the first 20 minutes. He simply turned the pages of Alexei's file with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Alexei watched the oil lamp flicker, casting long, skeletal shadows across the peeling gray paint of the walls. He expected the usual, a shout, a fist, or the cold metal of a Nagant revolver pressed against his temple. He was a philologist, a man of words, and he had already accepted that he would die among these frozen wastes for the crime of owning a volume of forbidden poetry. Then, the impossible happened. Sokolov reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a silver pencil, and made a small correction in the margin of the file. As he did so, he let out a sharp, frustrated sigh and muttered under his breath in a voice so low it was almost a ghost of a sound. He whispered a line from Mandelstam about the black sun and the icy silence of the tomb. Alexei felt a jolt of electricity run through his spine. It was not just the quote, it was the rhythm of the delivery. The way the officer lingered on the vowels like a man who had spent his life lecturing in the halls of the Leningrad State University. Alexei leaned forward an inch, his eyes narrowing. Sokolov's hand moved toward his face. It was a reflexive motion, a ghost of a habit. He raised his middle finger and thumb to the bridge of his nose, pushing upward as if to adjust a pair of spectacles that were not there. It was the unmistakable gesture of a professor, an academic who had spent decades pushing heavy, horn-rimmed glasses back into place while debating the nuances of Hegelian dialectics. Sokolov caught himself. His hand froze in midair, his eyes darting toward Alexei with a sudden, predatory sharpness. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, and Alexei saw not a major of the NKVD, but a man drowning in a sea of terror. The officer's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the desk. The major cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. He spoke in a harsh, forced baritone, demanding to know the names of the co-conspirators who had attended the secret readings in 1934. But the conviction was gone. Alexei realized then that the uniform did not fit the man's soul. The shoulders of the tunic were slightly too broad, and the way the leather belt dug into his waist suggested a man who had recently lost a great deal of weight, a man who was used to the starvation rations of the camps, not the hearty meals of the officers' mess. Alexei decided to test the water. He did not answer the question about the names. Instead, he mentioned a rare edition of Ovid that had been mentioned in the very poetry Sokolov had just whispered. He spoke of the beauty of the Latin dactylic hexameter. Sokolov flinched. He tried to scowl, to bring the heavy hand of authority down upon the table, but his eyes betrayed him. They were moist, filled with a desperate, agonizing hunger for a conversation that did not involve death or betrayal. He leaned back, the shadows obscuring his face. He told Alexei that such talk was dangerous, that a man could be shot for less than a syllable of such decadence. But he did not call the guards. He did not reach for his whip. The interrogation lasted until 4 in the morning. By the time the sun began to rise over the jagged horizon of the Siberian tundra, a silent pact had been formed. Alexei saw the truth in the way Sokolov handled the silver pencil. The man was an imposter. The real Major Sokolov was likely rotting in a shallow grave, and this ghost in a blue-capped uniform was performing the most dangerous role ever conceived by the human mind. Alexei wondered how many others knew. The guards outside seemed to fear the major, but they also seemed distant. Sokolov rarely left his office, avoiding the communal dining hall and the rowdy drinking sessions of his subordinates. He lived like a hermit in the heart of the machine. As Alexei was led back to his freezing barack, he noticed one more detail. The major's boots were polished to a mirror shine, but the heels were worn down in a specific way, slanted inward. It was the gait of a man who walked miles of library aisles, not a man who marched on parade grounds. In the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies in despair. Alexei lay on his wooden plank, his mind racing. He had discovered a secret that could either set him free or get him killed 10 times over. He thought about the family Sokolov looked at through the window of his office. There was a small, dilapidated house on the edge of the settlement where a woman and 2 small children lived. They were the families of the dispossessed, the wives of the enemies of the state. Alexei realized that the imposter was not just hiding, he was protecting. The major was staying in the lion's den because his cubs were in the next cage. It was a tragedy written in blood and ink. He decided that he would help this man, not because he was a saint, but because in the middle of this hell, a shared line of poetry was the only thing that felt like home. Over the next 2 weeks, the interrogations became secret seminars. Sokolov would lock the door, and for 3 hours, they would discuss the fall of Rome and the structure of the Greek tragedy. Alexei helped the man forge the reports. He taught the imposter how to use the bureaucratic language of the NKVD to protect the innocent. They created a paper trail of ghosts, moving prisoners on paper while they remained hidden in plain sight. But the pressure was mounting. A new shipment of prisoners was arriving from Moscow, and with them, a high-ranking inspector from the Central Committee. The charade was reaching its breaking point. Sokolov's hands shook so violently now that he could barely hold his tea. He told Alexei that he had secured a truck. He had the papers ready to evacuate his family under the guise of a secret transport. Alexei felt a flicker of hope. He believed he was part of a great escape, a small victory against a monstrous system. He imagined the 3 of them, and the woman and children, disappearing into the vastness of the Soviet Union, changing their names and living in the shadows of the Ural Mountains. He did not see the coldness returning to the imposter's eyes. He did not see that the man who quoted Mandelstam was slowly being replaced by the monster he was pretending to be. The role was consuming the actor. To survive among the wolves, the man had to grow teeth, and those teeth were now pointed at the only witness to his crime. Alexei sat in the dark, waiting for the signal to move toward the truck. He looked at the stars, feeling for the first time in 3 years that he might see the spring. He trusted the man who adjusted his non-existent glasses. He trusted the man who loved Ovid. It was the greatest mistake of his life. The arrival of the inspector was heralded not by a fanfare, but by the terrifying silence that preceded his black sedan. It was the 25th of January, and the temperature had plummeted to 50 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. Colonel Vrubel arrived from Moscow with a suitcase full of execution orders and a pair of eyes that seemed to count the ribs of every man he passed. He was a man of the old guard, a literalist who believed that the revolution was a garden that required constant weeding. Alexei watched from the edge of the labor gang as Sokolov greeted the colonel. The major stood as rigid as a frozen corpse. His hands snapped to his cap in a salute that looked perfect to an outsider. But to Alexei, it looked like the desperate tension of a wire about to snap. The 2 officers walked toward the administrative building, their breath blooming in the air like white smoke. Alexei felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The professor was now standing in the light of a man who specialized in shadows. That night, the interrogation room felt different. The smell of Vrubel's expensive Turkish tobacco lingered in the hallway, a scent of luxury that felt like a death warrant. When Alexei was brought in, Sokolov did not look up. He was staring at a map of the railway lines, his fingers tracing the veins of the Soviet Union. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. The skin hung loose on his cheekbones, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "The colonel is suspicious," Sokolov whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "He asks why our execution quotas are 4% lower than the neighboring camps. He asks why I have not requisitioned more lye for the pits. He is looking for a crack in the dam, Alexei, and he knows I am not a career officer. He senses the scent of the university on me." Alexei sat down, his heart hammering. "What do we do? We have the truck. We have the papers." Sokolov finally looked at him. For a moment, the academic returned. He adjusted those invisible glasses, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We move the date forward. We leave tomorrow night. The inspector will be busy with the quarterly audit of the timber exports. It is our only window. But there is a problem, Alexei. The manifest for the truck requires 3 signatures. Mine, the head of the motor pool, and the senior prisoner overseer. The senior overseer was a man named Volkov, a career criminal, a Vori who ran the internal life of the barracks with a shiv and a snarl. He was the only prisoner who had access to the administrative wing. To get his signature meant bringing a wolf into their glass house. "I will talk to Volkov," Alexei said, though the thought made him feel sick. "He owes me for the letters I wrote to his mother." Sokolov nodded, but he seemed distracted. He began to recite a passage from the Aeneid, the part where Aeneas carries his father out of the burning ruins of Troy. His voice trembled. "I am not carrying a father, Alexei. I am carrying a wife who can no longer walk, and a daughter who has forgotten the sound of music. If I fail, they won't not just kill us. They will make us wish for death as a mercy." The following day was a blur of frantic, silent preparation. Alexei managed to corner Volkov behind the sawmills. The criminal listened, his eyes narrowed, a gold tooth glinting in the pale winter sun. He signed the paper not for the letters, but for the promise of a crate of tinned beef from the officer's stores. As he handed the pen back to Alexei, he spat in the snow. "You're playing a dangerous game, teacher," Volkov said. "That major of yours, he's got the look of a man who's already dead. Do not let him pull you into the hole with him." As the sun dipped below the horizon on the 26th of January, the camp fell into its usual rhythmic misery. The guards were huddled in their towers, more interested in their vodka than the dark shapes moving near the motor pool. Sokolov had managed to divert the evening patrol to the western perimeter. The truck, a heavy Gaz 63, stood idling, its exhaust forming a thick shroud in the frozen air. Alexei helped the woman and the 2 children crawl into the back. The wife was a wraith, her eyes wide with a hollow, haunting terror. She did not ask questions. She simply clung to her children as if they were the only solid objects in a dissolving world. Alexei covered them with heavy canvas sacks and crates of empty shell casings. Sokolov appeared from the shadows, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat over his NKVD uniform. He looked at Alexei, and for the first time, there was no poetry in his gaze. There was only a cold, hard calculation. "Get in the back," Sokolov commanded. "You will keep them quiet. If the children cry at the checkpoint, you stifle them. Do you understand?" "I understand," Alexei whispered. They began the slow crawl toward the main gate. The headlights of the truck cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the barbed wire and the frozen mud. At the gate, a young guard stepped out of the shack, squinting against the light. He recognized the major's vehicle and began to raise the barrier. But then, the door to the guardhouse opened, and Colonel Vrubel stepped out. He was not wearing his coat, just his tunic, as if the cold could not touch him. He signaled for the truck to stop. Alexei felt the woman beside him stop breathing. He pressed his hand over the youngest child's mouth. His own heart vibrating with such force, he feared the colonel would hear it through the metal walls of the truck. Sokolov leaned out of the window. "Colonel, is there a problem?" Vrubel walked slowly around the truck, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped at the back, just inches from where Alexei lay hidden. He tapped the tailgate with his cane. "A late night for a transport, Major, especially one not listed on my evening briefing. It is a special requisition for the timber station at Point 44, Sokolov said, his voice a perfect imitation of board authority. "Urgent repairs for the saws. You know how Moscow feels about the quotas." Vrubel hummed, a low, vibrating sound. "Yes, the quotas. Always the quotas." He walked back to the driver's window and leaned in, his face inches from Sokolov's. "You know, Major, I spent the afternoon reading your service record. It is exemplary. Almost too exemplary. Not a single reprimand in 15 years. Not a single error in a report. You move through this world like a man who has memorized a script." Sokolov did not flinch. "I am a loyal servant of the party, Colonel." Vrubel smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Of course you are. But tell me, since you are a man of such precision, why did you sign the transport manifest using the old orthography, the pre-revolutionary spelling of the word consignment? It is a habit of the old intelligentsia, would not you say? A professor's mistake, perhaps?" The silence that followed was longer than any Alexei had ever experienced. He reached for a heavy wrench lying on the floor of the truck, his fingers closing around the cold iron. He was ready to kill, ready to die. Then Sokolov laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that cut through the wind. "My father was a clerk for the Tsar, Colonel. Some habits are beaten into us as children. If you want to court-martial me for my spelling, do it tomorrow. Tonight, I have a deadline at Point 44. Vrubel stared at him for a long time, then stepped back and waved his hand. "Proceed, Major. But remember, the snow hides many things, but it never hides them forever." The truck lurched forward. As they cleared the gate and accelerated into the dark forest, Alexei let out a sob of relief. They had done it. They were out. He looked at the woman, who was now weeping silently into her hands. They were heading for the mountains, for a new life. But as the truck gained speed, Alexei noticed something strange. They were not turning toward the mountain pass. They were heading deeper into the forest, toward the dead zone, a vast, unmapped swamp where the camp disposed of its most problematic waste. "Major," Alexei called out, tapping on the small window behind the driver's seat. "Major, you missed the turn." Sokolov did not answer. He kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his face illuminated by the dashboard light, frozen in a mask of absolute, terrifying resolve. The man who adjusted his glasses was gone. The man who loved Mandelstam was gone. There was only the Major now, and the Major had one last report to file. The truck rattled over the frozen ruts of the logging road, the engine groaning under the strain of the deep snow. Alexei watched the silhouettes of the pine trees flash past like skeletal fingers. He hammered on the glass again, his knuckles raw. The woman beside him had stopped crying. She sat upright, her eyes fixed on the back of the driver's head with a sudden, sharp clarity. She knew. In the way that only those who have lived under the constant shadow of death can know, she sensed the shift in the air. The truck suddenly swerved and came to a halt in a clearing surrounded by ancient, towering firs. The headlights illuminated a small, sagging shack used by hunters, or perhaps forgotten by a long-dead surveying team. Sokolov cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Sokolov stepped out of the cab. When he opened the back of the truck, the freezing air hit Alexei like a physical blow. The Major stood there, the silver moonlight catching the brass buttons of his coat. He looked at the woman and the children, then at Alexei. His face was a blank slate, devoid of the scholarly warmth that had defined their secret hours in the interrogation room. "Out," Sokolov commanded. "Major, what is this place?" Alexei asked, his voice cracking. "The mountain pass is 20 miles to the west. We are heading toward the marshes." "Out," the major repeated, his hand resting on the holster of his nagant. They climbed down into the knee-deep snow. The children huddled against their mother, who stood with a terrifying dignity, her gaze never leaving the man she had once called her husband. Sokolov pointed toward the shack. "There is a stove inside and enough wood for 2 days. There is also a cache of food and civilian clothes for the woman and the children." Alexei felt a surge of hope, though it was tainted by a bitter aftertaste. "And what about us? When do we move toward the border?" Sokolov looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the professor returned. He reached up and adjusted the bridge of his non-existent glasses. "You do not understand, Alexei. Colonel Vrubel is not a man who makes idle threats. He did not let us pass because he believed my lie about the spelling. He let us pass because he wanted to see where the rat would run. He is already on his way. He will be here by dawn. Then we have to go, now." Alexei grabbed the major's arm, but the man was as immovable as stone. "There is no we, Alexei," Sokolov said quietly. "If Vrubel finds an empty truck and a missing major, he will hunt us across the entire Union. He will find them." He pointed at the children. "But if he finds the major, dead at his post, having executed a group of escapees, the file will be closed. The search will end." Alexei's blood ran cold. You brought us here to kill us? To save your own identity?" Sokolov shook his head. "No, I brought them here to save them. But a sacrifice is required to satisfy the bureaucracy. The machine needs blood to stop its gears. If Vrubel finds 3 bodies and a major who died in a struggle with a dangerous counter-revolutionary, he won't not look for a mother and 2 children in the woods. He will have his victory. He will have his report." Sokolov pulled the revolver from his holster. Alexei stepped back, his hands raised. "Major, listen to me. This is not poetry. This is not the Aeneid. This is murder. You are the man who quoted Mandelstam. You are the man who wept over the loss of the libraries. I am the man who killed a major of the NKVD, Sokolov replied, his voice flat. And I am the man who will now ensure that he never existed. He did not point the gun at Alexei. He handed it to him. Alexei froze, the cold metal burning his palm. What? The body in the truck, Sokolov said, gesturing to the cab. It must be mine. I have the papers in my pocket that identify me as the traitor, but I cannot shoot myself in the back of the head and then burn the documents. You will do it. You will take the woman and the children through the marsh. I have marked the path. It leads to a village where the priest is a friend of my father's. He will hide them. But you'll be dead, Alexei whispered. I died the moment I put on this uniform, the man said. Now, finish the script. It is the only way the story ends with them living. The woman stepped forward and touched the man's cheek. She did not say a word. She did not cry. She simply kissed his forehead and took the children by the hands, leading them toward the shack. She had already accepted the price. Alexei stood in the snow, the weight of the gun feeling like a mountain. He looked at the man who had been his only friend in hell. Sokolov knelt in the snow, his back to Alexei. He began to recite a poem, something old in Latin, a prayer for the voyagers of the night. Do it, Alexei, the man commanded. Before the sun comes up, before I lose the courage to be a hero. Alexei raised the gun. His hands shook. He thought of the professor, the library, the hidden books, and the terrible, beautiful lie they had lived. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The sound shattered the silence of the forest. A single, sharp punctuation mark at the end of a long, dark sentence. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon on the 27th of January, Colonel Vrubel's sedan arrived at the clearing. He found the truck, the engine cold, and the body of Major Sokolov slumped over the steering wheel, a bullet through his brain and a confession of treason clutched in his stiffening hand. Nearby, the bodies of 3 prisoners, a man, a woman, and 2 small bundles, lay partially covered by a tarp, their faces unrecognizable from the frost and the brutality of their end. Vrubel stood over the major's body and poked it with his cane. He looked at the blood on the snow and the charred remains of the transport manifest. He smiled. "A perfect ending," he muttered to his adjutant. "The traitor is dead, and the witnesses are silenced. Close the file." 10 miles away, deep in the frozen heart of the marsh, Alexei led a woman and 2 children toward a thin plume of smoke on the horizon. His boots were worn down at the heels, slanted inward. He stopped for a moment, his hand instinctively reaching up to adjust the bridge of his nose, pushing upward against a pair of glasses that were no longer there. He looked back at the forest. He had the woman. He had the children. But as he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper he had taken from the major's desk before they left. He pulled it out and read the last line Sokolov had ever written. It was not a poem. It was not a prayer. It was a list of names, every prisoner in Alexei's barracks, including Alexei himself, with a single word written in the margin in the major's elegant, professorial hand. Expendable. Alexei realized then that the bodies under the tarp were not sacks of grain or straw. They were the 3 men who had shared his cell, killed by Sokolov hours before they had even reached the truck. The major had not sacrificed himself to save Alexei. He had used Alexei as an executioner to clean up the evidence of his own existence, ensuring that no one who knew the real man would ever walk out of that forest alive. Alexei looked at the woman and the children. They were free, but they were the property of a ghost who had murdered his way to a clean slate. Alexei dropped the paper into the snow and kept walking, the silver pencil in his pocket feeling like a dagger against his thigh. He was free, but he was no longer a philologist. He was a shadow, moving through a world of snow, carrying the guilt of a man who had mastered the art of the perfect ending.